The rain hammered against the windows, a relentless rhythm that filled the house with a dull roar. I stood in the kitchen, wiping down the counter for the third time that evening. The dishes were done, Mark was upstairs already asleep, and the silence in our home had grown louder than the storm outside. It was always like this, his long work hours, his constant exhaustion. Our conversations were minimal, and our connection felt thinner with each passing day. I told myself it was normal after 10 years of marriage, but some nights, like tonight, the void felt unbearable. A sharp knock at the door startled me, breaking my thoughts. I glanced at the clock. It was nearly 10. Who could be out in this weather? Wrapping my cardigan tighter around myself, I walked to the door, hesitant but curious. When I opened it, there he stood. Eric, Mark's best friend from college. His hair was plastered to his forehead, his leather jacket dripping with rain. "Hey, Nora," he said with an apologetic grin. "Sorry to drop in like this, but my car broke down a few blocks away. My phone's dead and, well, I figured you and Mark wouldn't mind." I blinked, still processing his sudden appearance. Eric hadn't been over in months, maybe a year, though he and Mark occasionally met for drinks. There was something about him that always put me at ease, a warmth in his demeanor that felt so different from Mark's distant practicality. "Of course, come in," I said, stepping aside. "You're soaked. Let me get you a towel." As he entered, shaking off the rain like a drenched stray dog, the house seemed to fill with his presence. Eric was taller than Mark, his shoulders broader. There was a casual charm about him that had always made me smile. I handed him a towel, which he used to ruffle his dark hair before draping it over his neck. "I didn't mean to intrude," he said, his voice low, almost apologetic. "I just didn't know where else to go." "You're not intruding," I assured him, leading him to the kitchen. "Mark's already asleep, but I can set you up in the guest room. Do you want something to drink? Tea, maybe?" He smiled, leaning casually against the counter. "Tea sounds great, thanks." As I busied myself boiling water and preparing 2 mugs, Eric filled the silence with stories about his latest adventures. He'd been traveling for work, some marketing project that took him across the country. I found myself laughing at his anecdotes, the way he mimicked his boss's exasperation or described the chaotic airport scenes. It was the kind of easy conversation I hadn't had in a long time. When I handed him the steaming mug, our fingers brushed briefly, a harmless, fleeting touch, but I felt it linger in the quiet space between us. He didn't seem to notice, or maybe he pretended not to. "So, how are things with you and Mark?" he asked, his tone light but curious. I hesitated, my smile faltering. "Busy," I replied, stirring my tea even though there was nothing left to dissolve. "He's been working a lot. Late nights, you know how it is." Eric nodded, his expression thoughtful. "He always was a bit of a workaholic, but he's lucky to have you. Not everyone could handle that." I laughed softly, though it sounded hollow even to me. Sometimes I wonder if he even notices. The words slipped out before I could stop them, and Eric's gaze sharpened. For a moment, I thought he might press me, but instead, he offered a small, understanding smile. "He notices more than you think. Mark's just not great at showing it." "Maybe," I said, though I wasn't convinced. I quickly changed the subject, asking him about his family, his hobbies, anything to steer the conversation away from the aching gap in my marriage. But as we talked, I realized how much I missed this. Talking, laughing, feeling seen. Eric's attention was undivided, his presence grounding in a way I hadn't experienced in years. By the time we finished our tea, the rain had slowed to a steady drizzle, but the warmth in the kitchen felt insulating. I showed Eric to the guest room, turning on the bedside lamp and laying out fresh towels. "I hope this is okay," I said, suddenly self-conscious about the state of the room. It was functional, but far from inviting. "It's perfect," he assured me, standing in the doorway. "Thanks for everything, Nora, really." I smiled, lingering for a moment longer than necessary. "Good night, Eric." "Good night," he replied, his voice softer now, almost intimate. As I walked back to my bedroom, I felt a strange mix of emotions. Relief that Eric was safe and comfortable, guilt for the flutter of excitement his presence had stirred, and something else, a yearning I couldn't quite name. Mark was already snoring lightly when I climbed into bed. I stared at the ceiling, listening to the rain and the faint creak of the house settling. I told myself to sleep, to forget the way Eric's smile had made me feel. But sleep didn't come easily that night. Edric's sudden arrival had merely disrupted my routine. Yet deep down, I knew it was more than that. There had been a shift in the air tonight. Yet deep down, I knew it was more than that. There had been a shift in the air tonight. And there was someone around, close to me. I suddenly reached the decision of how I would decide to fall in love. I couldn't quite figure out how to do it. I thought it would. I rolled onto my side, glancing at Mark's sleeping form. His face, half buried in the pillow, was calm, oblivious. It struck me how distant we had become, like two strangers sharing a bed. I sighed, quietly slipping out of the covers and padding barefoot down the hall. The guest room door was closed, but as I approached, I noticed a faint light seeping out from underneath. He was awake. I paused outside the door, hesitating. It wasn't my place to intrude, but something drew me forward, an invisible pull I couldn't resist. I tapped softly, the sound barely audible. "Eric?" I whispered. The door opened almost immediately, as if he'd been waiting. He stood there in a plain white t-shirt and sweatpants, his hair still slightly damp from the rain earlier. "Couldn't sleep either?" he asked, a wry smile tugging at the corner of his lip. I shook my head. "I guess not." He stepped aside, gesturing for me to come in. I hesitated for a moment before crossing the threshold, feeling a strange mix of guilt and anticipation. The room was dimly lit by the bedside lamp, casting a warm golden glow over the modest space. "I was just reading," he said, motioning to the book on the nightstand. "Helps me wind down." "What are you reading?" I asked, trying to focus on the mundane details, anything to steady my racing thoughts. He picked up the book, showing me the cover. "Some mystery novel I found in an airport. It's decent, but nothing to write home about." I laughed softly, easing into the conversation. Mark loves mysteries. He always tries to guess the ending before he's halfway through. Eric smiled, but there was a shadow behind it, as though he was weighing his words carefully. He always liked solving puzzles, didn't he? Finding answers. There was an unspoken layer to his comment, but I didn't press. Instead, I sat on the edge of the chair near the window, pulling my knees up to my chest. "I feel like I haven't talked to him in weeks," I admitted quietly. "Not really, anyway." Eric sat on the bed, leaning forward with his elbows on his knees. Relationships are hard, he said, his voice soft but firm, especially when life gets in the way. Mark means well, Nora. He just forgets how to show it. Maybe, I said, though the words felt hollow. Or maybe he just stopped trying. Eric looked at me then, his gaze intense and unwavering. You deserve more than that. The weight of his words hung between us, heavy and electric. I felt my breath catch, my chest tightening as emotions I had buried for so long began to surface. It's not that simple, I said, my voice trembling slightly. We've been together for so long. I don't even know who I am without him. Eric reached out, his hand brushing against mine for the briefest moment. The touch sent a jolt through me, a spark that ignited something I hadn't felt in years. You're stronger than you think, Nora, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. The room seemed to shrink around us, the air thick with unspoken tension. I wanted to pull away, to create distance, before the line between us blurred any further, but I couldn't move. His presence was magnetic, grounding me in a way that felt both exhilarating and terrifying. I should go back to bed, I said, finally breaking the silence. Eric didn't stop me, but his eyes lingered on mine, a mixture of longing and restraint. Good night, Nora. Good night, I replied, my voice softer than I intended. I slipped out of the room, my heart pounding in my chest. Back in my own bed, I stared at the ceiling once more, replaying the moment over and over in my mind. The next morning, Mark was gone before I even woke up. A note on the counter explained he had an early meeting and would be back late. Typical. I sighed, pouring myself a cup of coffee as the sunlight streamed through the windows. The house felt too quiet again, but not for long. Eric appeared in the kitchen doorway, his hair messy from sleep. He looked different in the morning light, softer, more vulnerable. Morning, he said, his voice still rough from sleep. Morning, I replied, offering him a mug. Coffee? He nodded, taking it gratefully. Thanks. You're a lifesaver. We stood in comfortable silence for a moment, sipping our coffee. The tension from the night before hadn't dissipated, but it had settled into something quieter, more subdued. You're up early, I said, breaking the quiet. Couldn't sleep much, he admitted, his gaze meeting mine. Kept thinking. About what? I asked, though part of me wasn't sure I wanted to know the answer. He hesitated, looking down at his coffee. About how things have changed. Between me and Mark. Between you and Mark. The honesty in his voice caught me off guard. I wasn't used to this kind of vulnerability, least of all from someone like Eric. Things are complicated, I said carefully. They don't have to be, he replied, his voice steady but low. He looked at me then, his eyes searching mine for something I wasn't sure I could give. I felt a lump rise in my throat, the weight of his words pressing down on me. Eric, Before I could finish, the sound of the coffee pot clicking off broke the moment. The spell was shattered, and I turned away, busying myself with cleaning the counter. Eric didn't push further, but I could feel his presence behind me, the unspoken tension still crackling between us. As the day wore on, we fell into an easy rhythm, cleaning up the house and sharing quiet moments here and there. But beneath the surface, the storm hadn't passed. It was only just beginning. The day unfolded in slow, deliberate beats, each moment thick with unspoken tension. After breakfast, Eric offered to help tidy up the house. It wasn't much. wiping down counters, straightening the living room. But the shared activity made the house feel less hollow, less lonely. Yet every glance, every accidental touch seemed to hum with an energy I couldn't ignore. We found ourselves in the kitchen again, this time sorting through a pile of neglected mail. I handed him a letter addressed to Mark, our fingers brushing once more. This time, neither of us pulled away immediately. His hand lingered, his thumb grazing the edge of mine. He looked up, and our eyes locked. "You're trembling," he said, his voice soft, concerned. His brow furrowed, but he didn't press further. Instead, he set the letter aside and leaned against the counter, watching me. "You've been holding everything together for so long, haven't you?" he asked quietly. His words struck a chord deep within me. I swallowed hard, trying to keep my composure. "Someone has to," I replied, my voice barely above a whisper. Eric nodded, his expression thoughtful. "But who's holding you together, Nora?" The question hung in the air, heavy and unavoidable. I felt tears prick at the corners of my eyes, but I blinked them away. I wasn't ready to confront the truth he was so gently offering me. "Let's finish this," I said abruptly, turning my attention back to the pile of mail. But the tension between us was impossible to ignore. It followed us through the morning, growing heavier with each passing hour. By midday, the rain had returned, a steady drizzle that drummed against the windows. I suggested we take a break, and Eric readily agreed. We sat in the living room, the muted light from the overcast sky casting a soft glow over the space. I handed him a throw blanket, and he draped it over his legs, flashing me a grateful smile. "This feels nice," he said, leaning back against the couch. "It's been a while since I've just relaxed like this." I nodded, curling up in the armchair across from him. It's easy to forget how to slow down sometimes. He chuckled, the sound warm and comforting. "You always were good at grounding people, Nora. Even back in college, you had this way of making everyone feel at ease." I tilted my head, surprised by his observation. "You remember that?" "Of course I do," he said, his gaze steady. "You've always had this light about you. It's hard to forget." His words sent a shiver down my spine, not from the cold but from the intensity of his sincerity. I felt my defenses faltering, the walls I'd built around myself beginning to crumble. "I don't feel very light these days," I admitted, my voice trembling. "It feels like I've been fading for years, and no one's noticed." "I've noticed," he said quietly. I looked at him then, truly looked at him, the way his eyes softened, the way his shoulders seemed to carry an invisible weight. He wasn't just speaking for my sake. He understood. "Who shouldn't say things like that?" I whispered, my heart pounding in my chest. "Why not?" he asked, his voice steady but low. "It's the truth." The rain outside grew heavier, the sound filling the silence between us. I wanted to stand, to walk away before the moment spiraled further, but my body wouldn't move. I was rooted in place, caught in the magnetic pull of his presence. "Nora," he said, his tone softer now, almost pleading, "you deserve to feel alive again." His words shattered the fragile barrier I'd been clinging to. Without thinking, I stood, moving toward the window, my back to him. "You don't understand," I said, my voice breaking. "This isn't just about me. There's Mark, there's—" He rose, closing the distance between us. "I know," he said, his voice low but firm. "But when was the last time you did something for yourself? Something that made you happy?" I turned to face him, my breath hitching as I saw the emotion in his eyes. He was so close now, close enough to feel the warmth radiating from him. I searched for words, any words, but none came. My thoughts were a tangled mess, my heart and mind warring against each other. He reached out, his hand hesitating for a moment before brushing against my arm. The touch was gentle, almost reverent. "Tell me to stop," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "If you don't want this, just say the word." I opened my mouth, ready to tell him to stop, to take a step back, but the word wouldn't come. Instead, I stood frozen, my heart pounding as the moment stretched between us. He leaned in, his movements slow, giving me every opportunity to pull away, but I didn't. His lips brushed against mine, tentative at first, as if he was afraid I might break, and maybe I would. But in that moment, all I could feel was the warmth of his touch, the intensity of his presence. The kiss deepened, and for the first time in years, I felt something inside me stir, something I thought I had lost forever. It was terrifying and exhilarating all at once, a collision of emotions that left me breathless. When we finally broke apart, the reality of what had just happened crashed down around me. I stepped back, my hand flying to my mouth. We can't, I stammered, the words tumbling out in a rush. Eric looked at me, his expression a mixture of longing and regret. "I'm sorry," he said, his voice heavy with emotion. "I didn't mean to." I shook my head, cutting him off. "It's not just you. I don't know what I'm doing anymore." He reached for me again, but I took another step back. "I need some air," I said, my voice shaking. Without waiting for a response, I grabbed my coat and stepped out onto the porch, the rain washing over me as I tried to catch my breath. My thoughts were a whirlwind, my heart aching with the weight of what had just transpired. Inside, Eric stayed behind, his silhouette visible through the rain-streaked window. Neither of us moved to close the distance again, but the storm raging outside was nothing compared to the one brewing within me. The rain continued to pour well into the evening, as though the sky itself felt the weight of the tension that had settled over the house. I stayed on the porch for what felt like hours, letting the cold droplets sting my skin. I needed the discomfort, something to ground me in the midst of the chaos swirling inside. I replayed the kiss in my mind, the way Eric's touch had ignited something I hadn't felt in years. It was a moment of weakness, I told myself, a mistake that could never happen again. But the memory of it lingered, as vivid as the rain soaking through my coat. When I finally stepped back inside, Eric was sitting on the couch, his elbows resting on his knees, his head bowed. He looked up when he heard me, his eyes searching mine. "Nora," he began, but I raised a hand to stop him. "We can't," I said, my voice firm despite the tremor in it. "This, whatever this is, it has to stop." He nodded slowly, though the pain in his eyes was unmistakable. "I know," he said quietly. "I never meant to complicate things. I just—" "Don't," I interrupted, shaking my head. "We both know it's wrong. Mark, he doesn't deserve this." Eric exhaled deeply, running a hand through his hair. "You're right," he admitted, though the words seemed to cost him. "I'll leave in the morning." Something in my chest tightened at the thought. It was the right thing to do, the only thing to do, but the idea of him leaving filled me with a sense of loss I couldn't quite explain. "Maybe that's for the best," I said softly, more to convince myself than him. The rest of the evening passed in strained silence. I retreated to my room, leaving Eric alone in the living room. Mark was still at work, blissfully unaware of the storm brewing in his own home. I sat on the edge of the bed, staring at the blank wall in front of me, the weight of my guilt pressing down like a physical force. What had I been thinking? How had I let things spiral so far out of control? I didn't hear Mark come home until his voice echoed up the stairs. "Nora, I'm back." I froze for a moment, my heart pounding. I forced myself to stand, smoothing my hair and wiping at my face as though it might erase the turmoil inside. "I'm upstairs," I called, trying to keep my voice steady. Mark appeared in the doorway a moment later, loosening his tie as he leaned against the frame. "Eric said his car broke down. That's some bad luck." I nodded, avoiding his gaze. "Yeah, he'll get it sorted in the morning." Mark frowned, studying me. "You okay? You seem off." "I'm fine," I lied quickly, forcing a small smile. "Just tired." He didn't look convinced, but he didn't press the issue. Instead, he leaned in to kiss my forehead, a gesture that once would have comforted me but now felt hollow. "Get some rest," he said. "I'll see you in the morning." I nodded again, watching as he disappeared down the hall. I closed the door behind him, leaning against it as the weight of the day threatened to overwhelm me. Sleep didn't come easily that night. I tossed and turned, haunted by the memory of Eric's kiss and the guilt that followed. The next morning, the house was quiet when I woke. Mark had left early again, his usual note on the counter, a stark reminder of the distance between us. Eric was in the kitchen, his suitcase already packed and sitting by the door. He looked up when I entered, his expression unreadable. "I called a tow truck," he said, his voice carefully neutral. "They'll pick me up in an hour." I nodded, unsure of what to say. The silence between us was heavy, thick with everything left unsaid. I poured myself a cup of coffee. The simple act of creating some space kept me from moving a step further. "Nora," he began, but I shook my head. "Don't," I said quietly. "It's better this way." He nodded, though his shoulders sagged slightly. "For what it's worth," he said after a moment, "I never wanted to hurt you or Mark." "I know," I replied, my voice barely above a whisper. "But we both let this happen, and now we have to live with it." The hour passed quickly, and before I knew it, the tow truck had arrived. Eric stood by the door, his hand on the handle as he turned to look at me one last time. "Take care of yourself, Nora," he said, his voice soft but firm. "You too," I replied, my chest tightening as he stepped out into the rain. I watched from the window as he climbed into the truck, his silhouette fading into the distance. The house felt impossibly empty after he left, the silence almost unbearable. Days turned into weeks, and life fell back into its usual rhythm. Mark remained as busy as ever, oblivious to the storm that had briefly disrupted our lives. I threw myself into routines, trying to drown out the lingering ache that Eric's departure had left behind. But some nights, as I lay awake staring at the ceiling, I couldn't help but wonder if I had made the right choice. Then, one evening, my phone buzzed on the counter. I picked it up, my breath catching as I read the message, "Thinking of you." I stared at the words, my heart pounding. For a moment I considered responding, letting myself get pulled back into the whirlwind I had barely escaped. But instead I deleted the message, setting the phone back down with trembling hands. The silence in the house seemed to stretch endlessly as I stood there, caught between the life I had and the one I had glimpsed in Eric's eyes. The rain began to fall again, soft and steady, as though the universe itself understood the weight of my choices. And for the first time in weeks, I let the tears come. The rain had stopped, leaving a muted quiet that felt almost deafening in its stillness. I stood at the sink, rinsing out the coffee cup Eric had used before he left. My fingers lingered on its rim as if it held some trace of him, some reminder of the storm he'd stirred within me. Life was supposed to return to normal now, wasn't it? But the ache in my chest told me otherwise. The text, "Thinking of you," still echoed in my mind, even though I had deleted it immediately. I had hoped that would be the end of it, that erasing it from my phone would somehow erase the feelings that accompanied it. But the knot in my stomach told me otherwise. Guilt mixed with longing in a way that left me dizzy. I turned away from the sink, desperate for distraction, and nearly jumped when I saw Mark standing in the doorway. "Didn't mean to startle you," he said, his tone casual, though his eyes studied me carefully. "You're home early," I replied, my voice strained as I tried to steady my breathing. "Everything okay?" He shrugged, stepping into the kitchen. Wrapped up the meeting sooner than I thought. Figured I'd come home, spend some time with you." The words caught me off guard. Mark hadn't made an effort like this in months, years even. I forced a smile, trying to mask the turmoil raging inside me. That's nice," I said, though it came out awkward, almost stilted. Mark pulled out a chair and sat at the table, his fingers drumming lightly against the wood. "So, Eric's car is all sorted?" he asked, his tone casual, but there was something in his eyes, something sharp, probing. "Yes," I said quickly, turning back to the sink to avoid his gaze. "The tow truck picked it up this morning. He should be on his way back by now." Mark was silent for a moment, the air in the room growing heavier with each passing second. "Funny thing," he said finally, his voice measured. "I ran into Eric at the gas station this afternoon. My breath hitched and I gripped the edge of the counter to steady myself." "Oh," I said, struggling to keep my tone even. "What a coincidence." Mark's chair scraped against the floor as he stood, his footsteps deliberate as he approached. "Yeah," he said, his voice low. He seemed nervous, kept avoiding eye contact, rushing through his words. It was strange, really. I turned to face him, forcing a laugh that sounded hollow even to my own ears. Eric's always been a little awkward in unexpected situations. You know that. Mark leaned against the counter, his arms crossed as he studied me. "You're right," he said, though there was a note of suspicion in his voice that sent a shiver down my spine. But he mentioned something interesting. "Oh?" I asked again, my heart pounding so loudly I was certain he could hear it. Mark tilted his head, his eyes narrowing slightly. "He said he appreciated us letting him stay, that you were especially accommodating." The blood drained from my face. My throat felt dry, my mind racing for an explanation, a way out of the trap I could feel closing around me. "I was just being polite," I said quickly. "He's your friend, Mark. What was I supposed to do?" Mark didn't respond immediately. Instead, he reached into his pocket, pulling out his phone. My stomach dropped as he swiped at the screen, his expression unreadable. "Funny thing," he said, his voice almost too calm. "I got a notification this morning, one of those home security apps. It records movement inside the house." I froze, my breath catching as he turned the phone toward me. The screen displayed a video thumbnail, the timestamp clearly marked for the previous night. My heart raced as he pressed play. The video showed Eric and me in the living room. Our conversation muted, but our body language unmistakable. The moment we'd kissed filled the frame, the angle capturing the closeness between us with damning clarity. My hand flew to my mouth, a gasp escaping before I could stop it. "Mark, I can explain," I began, but he cut me off with a sharp laugh, cold and bitter. "Explain?" he said, his voice rising. "Explain what, Nora? How you kissed my best friend? How you betrayed me in my own home?" Tears blurred my vision as I reached for him, but he stepped back, his expression one of disgust and pain. It it wasn't it wasn't what it looked like," I stammered, though the words felt weak even as I said them. Mark shook his head, his jaw tight. "Don't lie to me, Nora. Don't insult me with that." I crumpled into the chair, my hands trembling as I buried my face in them. "It was a mistake," I whispered. "I wasn't thinking. It just happened." "And what else just happened?" Mark demanded, his voice laced with venom. "Did he stay in the guest room? Or was that just for show?" His accusation hit like a slap, and I looked up, my tears streaming down my face. "No," I said firmly. "Nothing else happened, Mark, I swear to you." He didn't look convinced, his fists clenching at his sides. "I trusted you, Nora. I thought we were just going through a rough patch. But this is beyond anything I could have imagined." The weight of his words crushed me, and I felt the full impact of what I had done. "Mark," I said, my voice shaking, "I'm sorry. I know I've hurt you, and I'll do anything to make it right. Please, just give me a chance to fix this." He laughed bitterly, shaking his head. "Fix this? How do you fix something like this, Nora? How do I look at you again and not see what I saw in that video?" I opened my mouth to respond, but no words came. He stared at me for a long moment, his expression a mix of heartbreak and fury. Finally, he turned away, heading for the door. "Where are you going?" I called after him, my voice cracking. "I need air," he said coldly. "Don't wait up." The door slammed behind him, the sound echoing through the house like a gunshot. I sat there, numb, my mind a whirlwind of guilt and regret. I had thought the kiss was a momentary lapse, something I could bury and move on from. But the truth had a way of surfacing, no matter how deeply it was hidden. As the silence settled around me, I realized there was no escaping the consequences of my choices. The life I had known, the marriage I had built, now hung in the balance. And for the first time, I wasn't sure if there was anything left to salvage. His name echoed in my thoughts, stirring a fresh wave of turmoil. I hadn't heard from him since he'd left, but part of me wondered if he knew what had happened. Did he feel the same crushing guilt that I did, or had he already moved on, letting the moment dissolve into nothing more than a fleeting memory? Lost in thought, I barely noticed where I was until I found myself standing outside Eric's apartment building. I hadn't planned to come here. It was as though my feet had a mind of their own. I stood on the sidewalk, staring up at the darkened windows, debating whether to leave or knock. What was I even hoping for? Closure? An apology? Or something I didn't want to admit to myself? Before I could decide, the door opened, and there he was. Eric froze when he saw me, his expression a mix of surprise and wariness. "Nora," he said quietly, stepping outside. "What are you doing here?" I hesitated, my breath visible in the cool night air. I don't know," I admitted honestly. I just. I needed to talk to someone. He nodded, his posture tense as he glanced up and down the street. "Come inside," he said, holding the door open. The warmth of his apartment was a stark contrast to the chill outside, but it did little to ease the knot in my chest. I stood awkwardly in the middle of the living room as Eric closed the door behind me. The silence between us was heavy, filled with everything we weren't saying. "I know I shouldn't be here," I said finally, my voice trembling. "But I didn't know where else to go." Eric sighed, running a hand through his hair. "It's okay," he said, though his tone was cautious. "What happened?" "Mark knows," I said bluntly, the words falling like stones into the quiet room. "He found the security footage. He saw everything." Eric's face paled, and he sank onto the edge of the couch. "I didn't think..." He trailed off, shaking his head. "I'm so sorry, Nora. I never meant for any of this to happen." "Neither did I," said, tears welling in my eyes. "But it did, and now I don't know what to do." He looked at me then, his expression filled with a mix of guilt and longing. "What do you want to do?" he asked softly. The question hit me like a punch to the gut. What did I want? I had spent so long prioritizing Mark's needs, our marriage, our shared life, that I had lost sight of my own desires. And now, in the wreckage of it all, I wasn't sure where to begin. "I want to fix things," I said, though the words felt hollow. "I want to make it right with Mark." Eric nodded slowly, his gaze dropping to the floor. "I understand," he said, though there was a note of sadness in his voice. "You deserve that chance." His words were meant to comfort, but they only deepened the ache in my chest. "But what about us?" I asked, the question slipping out before I could stop it. Eric looked up sharply, his eyes filled with a conflict that mirrored my own. "Nora, there is no us," he said, though his voice wavered. "There can't be. Not after this." The finality of his words struck me like a slap, but I knew he was right. Whatever connection we had shared, whatever spark had drawn us together, it had been born from pain and emptiness. It wasn't real. It couldn't be. I stood there, the weight of everything pressing down on me until it was almost unbearable. "I should go," I said finally, my voice barely above a whisper. Eric didn't stop me. He walked me to the door, his expression unreadable as he held it open. "Take care of yourself, Nora," he said softly. "You too," I replied, forcing a small shaky smile before stepping out into the night. The walk home felt longer than it should have, each step heavy with the realization of what I had lost, what I had destroyed. When I reached the house, it was dark and quiet. Mark's car wasn't in the driveway, and a fresh wave of guilt washed over me. I had no idea where he had gone, or if he even planned to come back. Inside, the emptiness of the house was suffocating. I stood in the living room, staring at the spot where Eric and I had kissed, the memory now tainted by shame. My phone buzzed on the counter, startling me out of my thoughts. I picked it up, my heart sinking when I saw Mark's name on the screen. The message was short and to the point. "I need time. Don't call." I sank onto the couch, clutching the phone as though it might offer some semblance of comfort, but there was none to be found. The life I had spent years building was now in ruins, and I had no one to blame but myself. For the first time in weeks, the tears came freely. I cried for Mark, for Eric, for the person I had become. And when the tears finally subsided, I was left with a hollow silence, the realization that this was only the beginning of the long road ahead.